In the middle of a brutal snowstorm in northern America, a small roadside diner became the place where fear spoke louder than words. A young woman was cornered inside, while the people around her lowered their eyes and held on to their silence. But at a booth near the window, a former Navy SEAL and his loyal German Shepherd were watching everything. What no one expected was that the moment he stood up to protect her would uncover a secret buried beneath years of snow, fear, and lies. From threats inside the diner to hidden tracks in the frozen dark, this story will lead you into a truth that changed an entire town. If you believe courage, kindness, and faith can still shine through the darkest nights, stay with me until the very end of this story. And before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, or share your thoughts after you finish listening. And please like and subscribe to support the channel and help bring more powerful stories like this to life. Talon Voss had been driving for so many hours that the road had stopped feeling like geography and started feeling like endurance. Northern winter did that to a man. It stripped the world down to bone and weather. The sky became one endless sheet of iron gray. The road narrowed into a pale corridor between black pines burdened with snow. Even the silence outside the truck seemed heavier than silence should have been, as if the whole land were holding its breath beneath the storm. Talon sat behind the wheel with the stillness of a man who had spent too much of his life learning how not to waste movement. He was 44, tall and broad-shouldered, built like a structure that had survived bad years without collapsing. His burnt orange canvas coat, worn soft at the seams, hung open over a gray wool sweater. Dark jeans creased at the knee. Brown leather boots, scuffed by age and hard miles, rested steady on the pedals. His hair was short and dark brown, a little wind-tossed on top, with silver beginning at the temples. A shadow of rough beard framed his angular jaw. His eyes, gray-blue and deep-set, kept the road with the kind of patience that was almost stern. He had been a Navy SEAL once. That history still lived in him, not in swagger, not in the way lesser men liked to advertise danger, but in the disciplined economy of his body, in the habit of seeing exits before comfort, threats before scenery. Now he worked private security on long, remote contracts, the kind that paid well because they demanded silence, isolation, and weeks of cold professionalism in places where winter punished weakness fast. The job ahead was several hours farther north. He was not going to make it tonight. Snow swept across the windshield in white bands so thick they erased distance. The wipers fought hard and lost ground anyway. When the electronic road sign ahead flashed a warning about limited travel and possible closure, Talon exhaled once through his nose and accepted what the storm had already decided. In the passenger footwell, Orion lifted his head. The dog was a 5-year-old German Shepherd with a thick gray cream coat that looked almost silver where stray light touched it. His ears stood high and sharp, his muzzle darker than the rest of his face, his amber eyes intelligent and steady. Orion was large without heaviness, powerful without clumsiness. He had the posture of an animal who understood work, understood waiting, and understood the strange emotional weather of human beings better than most humans ever would. "You saw it before I did," Talon murmured. Orion blinked once as if the compliment had arrived late. Then, through the blur of snow, Talon saw the diner. Blue Lantern Diner stood alone just off the highway, its pale blue sign rocking slightly in the wind. Yellow light glowed through fogged windows. In that weather, it looked less like a business and more like a promise. A place that said, not in words, but in warmth, "Not tonight, not out there." Talon guided the truck into the lot beside two semis and a pickup crusted white with snow. By the time he stepped out, the wind came at him like a living thing. Orion jumped down beside him, snow catching at the long fur along his shoulders and back. Together they crossed the lot and pushed through the front door into warmth so sudden it almost hurt. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle. Inside, the diner felt like another country. The windows were filmed with steam. Amber light settled over wooden tables and red booths. The floor was old checkered tile, worn soft by years of boots and salt and winter slush. The smell was deep and layered. Coffee, beef stew, cinnamon, butter, bacon, fresh bread. The sort of smell that didn't just promise food. It promised that someone had decided people were worth feeding. A few faces turned their way and then relaxed. Near the counter sat a truck driver in his late 50s with a large frame and a weathered face the color of old leather. His thick gray mustache drooped over a mouth that looked built for skepticism but not cruelty. He wore a navy puffer jacket unzipped over a red flannel shirt, and his hands, wrapped around a coffee mug, were broad enough to look carved. There was something decent in the set of his shoulders, the kind of man who had probably seen too much roadside misery to romanticize life, but not enough to go numb. This was Wade Mercer. 2 stools away, a retired schoolteacher named Lena Foss sat with a paperback open in one hand and a teacup in the other. She was 67 and fine-boned, with a lined face that still held traces of the stern prettiness she must have carried in youth. Her silver hair was pinned back neatly, and her knitted cardigan looked as orderly as the stack of corrected papers she no longer had to grade. Her eyes, quick and observant behind thin reading glasses, flicked to Talon and Orion with immediate intelligence. Lena looked like the sort of woman who missed very little and forgot even less. A girl moved between the tables with a coffee pot in one hand and a plate balanced on the other. She was young, 19 at most, with auburn hair pinned back low at the nape of her neck. Loose strands curled damply near her cheeks from the heat of the kitchen. Her face was soft in shape but not in spirit. There was a quiet endurance in the line of her mouth and the effortful brightness of her smile. She was slim, quick, efficient, wearing a cream turtleneck under a navy diner apron, black jeans and dark boots made for slippery weather. Her brown eyes were warm, but the skin beneath them held the faint shadows of someone who had not been sleeping enough. She looked like a girl who had gotten good at carrying too much without asking who else should be helping. This was Marin Bell. "Anywhere you like," she told Talon, voice polite and low, with that particular small-town warmth that never felt fake because it had no energy to waste on theater. "You and your dog can take the corner booth if he stays close." "He stays close," Talon said. Orion seemed to approve the arrangement. He settled beneath the booth with his usual controlled grace, paws crossed, head up. Marin gave the dog a brief, tired smile. "He's beautiful. He knows it." That brought the smallest laugh out of her. It vanished quickly, but Talon noticed the way it softened her whole face for a second, as if laughter was a coat she rarely had time to put on anymore. From the kitchen passed through came the low clatter of dishes and the voice of an older man calling for more hash browns. Elias Bell emerged a moment later, carrying 2 steaming bowls. He was in his late 60s, lean and slightly stooped, with white hair combed to one side and the kind of lined, gentle face that seemed shaped by apology and patience. He wore a blue-gray flannel shirt under a brown apron, one hand pressed briefly against his chest when he thought no one was looking. Marin saw it anyway. "Dad?" "I'm fine," Elias said too fast. The answer was familiar enough that she didn't argue. which meant she had heard it many times before. Talon watched the exchange over the rim of his coffee cup. He had no business forming opinions about strangers. He did it anyway. Exhaustion in the daughter. Frailty in the father. A diner carrying more than food and bills on its back. For a few minutes, the world stayed simple. The storm hissed against the windows. Wade talked to Lena about highway closures and state plows. Marin refilled mugs. Orion rested, though not fully. Talon knew the difference. The dog's body was relaxed, but his eyes remained half open, reading the room through scent and sound. Talon ate slowly, grateful for heat, for salt, for the brief illusion that he had stepped outside the harsher parts of the world. Then the front door opened again. The cold came in first. 3 men entered with snow on their shoulders and an energy that changed the room before any of them spoke. Their boots left wet prints across the checkered tile. The man in front was tall and narrow, all hard angles and quiet arrogance. He wore a charcoal coat over a black high-neck sweater, dark-fitted pants, black gloves. His face was long and pale, his mouth thin, his eyes a flat winter gray. His blonde-brown hair was cut neat, but nothing about him felt truly clean. He had the polished restraint of a man who liked control more than violence because control lasted longer. This was Deke Harlan. Behind him came 2 broader men who looked like the rougher punctuation marks at the end of his sentences. One had a flattened nose and a permanent sneer. The other carried his thick body with the ugly confidence of someone used to taking up space just to make others smaller. The room quieted by instinct. Not dramatically. Just enough. A fork paused in midair. Wade stopped speaking. Lena lowered her book, but kept a finger between the pages. Marin's shoulders stiffened so slightly most people would have missed it. Orion did not miss it. His ears rose. His head lifted fully. His gaze fixed on the men with a stillness that was somehow more intense than aggression. Deke smiled when he saw Marin. There was no warmth in it. Only recognition and the lazy satisfaction of a man who had returned to a place where he expected to be obeyed. "Well," he said, brushing melted snow from one glove. "Looks like the Bell family's still open." Marin moved toward the coffee station. "You eating or just tracking slush all over the floor again?" There was spirit in the answer. Talon respected that. He also saw the cost of it in the tightness around her eyes. Deke's smile thinned. "Careful." From the kitchen, Elias went still, and there it was. The shift Talon had felt before in embassies, villages, compounds, city streets. Too many places to name. The moment before a room chose what it belonged to. Order or fear, decency or surrender. It was never as loud as stories made it sound. Usually it began in silence, in the way people looked down, in the way breathing changed. Orion rose without a sound. Not all the way at first, just enough to place weight onto his front paws, his nose lifting toward the air behind the men. Then he turned, not toward Deke's face, but toward the narrow hallway leading past the counter to the storage room and back door. He inhaled once, long and deliberate. Something in the dog's expression changed. Talon felt it immediately, a cold current beneath the warmth of the diner. Orion was not reacting only to hostility. He had caught another scent, something older, buried beneath wet wool and road salt, oil, damp wood, frozen earth, and something sharp enough to lodge an instinct. For the briefest moment, Lena Foss made the sign of the cross against her chest, without seeming to know she had done it. Then Marin reached for a mug, and it slipped a little in her hand. The sound of ceramic clinking against the counter snapped the room back into itself. Deke turned his head slowly toward Talon's booth, finally noticing the man in the burnt orange coat and the gray-cream shepherd watching from the floor. Outside, the storm pressed its white face against the glass. Inside, Talon set his coffee down and said nothing at all. But in the old, disciplined chambers of his mind, something had already begun to wake. Deke Harlan did not sit down right away. That was the first thing Talon noticed after the room went quiet. Men who came in for food looked for warmth first. They unbuttoned coats, stamped snow from their boots, rubbed their hands together, glanced toward the counter with the humble impatience of hunger. Deke did none of that. He stood in the center aisle with melting snow darkening the shoulders of his charcoal coat, one gloved hand resting near the back of a booth as if the place already belonged to him. His stillness was deliberate. He knew what he was doing to the room. He knew how to turn presence into pressure. The two men behind him were less controlled, but no less ugly for it. Moss was the broader one, thick through the neck and shoulders, with a flattened nose that looked as if life had once tried to teach him caution through violence and failed. He wore a dark work jacket stretched tight across a heavy stomach, and his hair was shaved close enough to show the pale shape of his skull beneath it. His face held a permanent smirk, the kind some men wore when they mistook cruelty for wit. He moved like a man who enjoyed making other people step aside. Ritter was leaner and taller, all elbows and bad intent. His cheeks were hollow from either hard living or mean blood. Patchy blonde stubble clung to his jaw, and his pale eyes had the vacant shine of a man who laughed hardest when someone else was ashamed. He carried his restlessness in small, jerking movements, tugging a glove, flexing his fingers, rocking slightly on his heels, as if boredom and malice kept colliding inside him. Marin Bell approached with a notepad in one hand and the coffee pot in the other, as though this were still an ordinary afternoon, and all men could be handled by good manners and steady breathing. Up close, the strain on her was easier to see. She had the kind of young face that should have belonged to someone thinking about college classes or bad dates or whether spring would come late this year. Instead, responsibility had already begun writing itself into her. The faint shadows under her hazel brown eyes, the way she kept her shoulders straight even when tiredness tugged them down, the careful economy in her movements, all of it belonged to someone who had learned too early that if she let herself unravel, there might be no one waiting to gather the pieces. "What'll it be?" she asked. Her voice stayed level, but Talon could hear the effort in it. Deke smiled without warmth. "You know what I'm here for." Marin did not blink. "Then you don't need a menu." A few people in the diner looked up, then quickly away. That was the second thing Talon noticed. Not cowardice exactly. Not at first. Something sadder than that. Recognition. The kind that came when people had seen this play before and knew how badly it could go if spoken lines were delivered in the wrong tone. Fear did not always arrive like panic. Sometimes it came wearing routine. Wade Mercer stared into his coffee as if the black surface might explain what a decent man owed a stranger when trouble came through the door. His thick hands tightened around the mug. The muscles in his jaw worked once, then stopped. Across the room, Lena Foss had lowered her paperback fully now, but she kept both hands folded over it in her lap, like a woman holding on to church decorum in a place where it no longer protected anyone. Behind the counter, Elias Bell stepped out from the kitchen pass-through, carrying a plate of toast he no longer seemed to remember. He was a narrow man with kind eyes, and a face lined by too many winters, too many bills, and too many years of saying yes to hardship because there had been no useful alternative. He saw Deke, and something old and weary passed through him. Not surprise, not exactly. Something closer to defeat, trying not to show its face. Deke glanced toward Elias, and then back at Marin. "Your father still thinking silence is a strategy?" Marin set the coffee pot down with care. "If you're not ordering, you can leave." Ritter laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came from the throat instead of the heart. "Hear that? Belle's got herself some backbone today." "Maybe weather does that," Moss said. "Makes people forget what they can afford." The words themselves were not loud. That was what made them uglier. Loud anger could sometimes be answered. This was different. This was pressure laid on slowly, like a hand over a mouth. Talon sat in the corner booth with his coffee cooling beside one untouched half of rye toast. He had learned long ago that rooms talked before people did. The shape of tension, the shift of breathing, the instinctive calculation in every body deciding whether to intervene, remain invisible, or attach itself to the strongest force present. Deke was not just harassing a young woman. He was conducting a test. How far could he push? How many witnesses would choose the safety of pretending? How much humiliation could be poured over one family before it turned into obedience? Orion remained beneath the table, but Talon knew better than to mistake stillness for calm. The dog's ears were angled forward, listening. His amber eyes moved from Deke to Moss, to Ritter, and back again, tracking balance, distance, tone. Orion had once been trained to read danger in compounds overseas, in ravines, in alleys, in shattered villages where men smiled moments before violence. He understood the chemistry of threat better than many people understood language. Marin moved to pass between Moss and the neighboring booth. Moss shifted half a step. That was all. Barely anything. But it forced her to turn sideways, close enough that the sleeve of his jacket brushed her apron. "Excuse me," she said. "Didn't hear any sir in there," Moss replied. Ritter chuckled again. "Maybe she only says that to paying customers." Marin kept walking. She did not give them the satisfaction of stopping. But Talon saw the tremor in the hand carrying the coffee pot. Small. Real. Human. Elias came forward then, setting the forgotten plate down too hard on the counter. "That's enough," he said. His voice was not weak. It was worse than weak. It was worn. It carried the sound of a man who had been forced to say those words too many times to the same kind of men, and had rarely been answered by justice. Deke turned his head slightly, almost in pity. "No, Elias. It stopped being enough a long time ago." That landed differently. Even the customers who had been pretending not to listen could hear there was a history in it. Not some random roadside ugliness. Something established. Something repeated. Something that had been gnawing at the edges of this family for longer than one bad afternoon. Marin took a breath. "Dad, go back inside." "No." The word surprised even him. It surprised Marin, too. For a second, something softer and more frightened crossed her face. Not because she wanted him silent, but because she knew the cost his body paid every time he stood against stress. Talon had seen Elias touch his chest in the kitchen. He saw the flush now under the older man's skin, the tightening at the mouth. A heart did not need to fail completely to become a hostage in moments like these. Deke noticed it too. Of course he did. His eyes moved lazily over Elias like a man assessing a cracked window frame. "You look tired." Marin stepped between them at once. "Don't." The room held its breath. Then, from the far end of the diner, a little girl at a booth near the window stood up on the seat and said, in the clear, unworried voice only children possess, "Mama, why is nobody helping?" The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Her mother, a pale woman in her 30s with wind-burned cheeks and a grocery store coat still dusted with snow, flushed deep red and tugged her daughter back down by the sleeve. But the question had already crossed the room like a struck match. For one suspended heartbeat, every adult in the diner had to face the shape of themselves through a child's eyes. Wade Mercer looked up first. Not all the way into courage yet, but into shame. Lena Foss closed her book. And Deke, who understood control better than kindness, smiled a little wider because he knew exactly how much people hated being seen when they were failing each other. The storm hissed against the windows. Inside, something invisible shifted. Marin swallowed and picked up the coffee pot again, as if ordinary work might still save the moment. "Last chance," she said quietly. "Order food or get out." Deke tilted his head. "You've become very bold." "I'm tired," she replied. "That's not the same thing." Something flickered in Talon then. Not admiration exactly, because admiration was too soft a word for the ache that came with watching someone stand upright when fear was already climbing their spine. He knew that kind of courage. Not battlefield courage. Not the dramatic variety men bragged about in bars. This was the courage of people with nowhere to retreat, still trying to preserve dignity under fluorescent lights and public silence. It was, in its own way, holier. Ritter drifted to one side, trailing damp boot prints toward the pie case. "Would be a shame if this place closed for weather, or inspections, or accidents." Marin turned sharply. "Don't touch anything." He grinned. "Make me." A couple in a booth near the wall stopped pretending to eat. The man looked maybe 30, clean-faced, office-soft, trapped halfway between disgust and paralysis. His wife reached under the table and caught his wrist, not to restrain him, but because she was afraid of what would happen if he did move. Fear worked that way. It spread from one body into another until stillness became communal. Wade's coffee mug clicked softly as he set it down. Not standing yet, but not hiding in the steam either. Talon noticed everything. The old rhythms came back to him as naturally as breath. Angles, distances, who might panic, who might freeze, who would turn mean once challenged, who was the real center of gravity. Deke was the spine of it. Moss the first muscle likely to throw weight. Ritter the one most likely to escalate out of boredom. Elias was fragile. Marin was cornered emotionally even before anyone blocked her physically. The room was full of potential witnesses and almost no one prepared for collision. Almost. Talon flexed one hand beneath the table. The old military watch at his wrist felt cold, despite the heat inside the diner. He had not come north to become part of anyone else's story. He had come because a job waited at the end of the road, because bills existed, because solitary work suited the parts of him that had never fully come home from war. He had built a life out of measured distance and useful silence. Getting involved was rarely wise. Wise men in winter stayed on schedule, protected their energy, and remembered that strangers' troubles were often deep wells with no bottom. But wisdom and conscience were not always the same animal. Marin moved again, trying to slip past Moss toward the register. This time, Moss did not merely fail to make room. He stepped directly into her path. It was a small invasion, almost laughably small from a distance. One body moving half a foot where another body needed space. Yet the ugliness of it hit Talon harder than shouting would have, because this was the point. Not noise, not drama. Domination. The deliberate theft of ordinary movement. The message was simple. Even here, even now we decide how you move in your own father's diner. Move, Marin said. Her voice broke on the word, just slightly. Moss leaned closer. Talon could see the sour amusement on his face from across the room. Ask nicer. Elias started forward too fast. Pain caught him in the same instant. His hand flew to his chest, fingers clawing at the flannel there, and he had to grab the edge of the counter to stay upright. Marin saw it and turned in reflex, trapped for one terrible beat between the man threatening her space and the father whose body was beginning to fold under stress. Dad! That was when the room changed for Talon. Not because danger had become obvious. Danger had been obvious from the beginning. Because the last excuse for waiting had disappeared. He could almost hear the old interior mechanisms closing into place. Training, instinct, moral fatigue, memory. The hard, bright remnant of the man he had once been before the world had taken so many liberties with hope. There were moments when a human being chose with logic. There were moments when choice came from some deeper framework made of old scars and stubborn decency. The door inside him shut. Talon set both hands on the table and rose. Talon Voss did not rise like a man searching for attention. He rose the way a gate swings shut in bad weather, quietly, inevitably, with a finality that made the air understand something had changed. The bench gave a soft scrape against the floor as he stepped out from the corner booth. His burnt orange canvas coat hung open, darkened in places where melting snow had not yet fully dried. Under the low amber lights of the diner, he looked older than he had from a distance, and stronger too. 44 sat on him not as decline but as weathering. His broad shoulders carried the kind of strength that had stopped being decorative years ago. His jaw was rough with evening stubble, his hair short and dark with pale silver at the temples, his face cut into clean, hard lines that suggested not cruelty but discipline. He had the look of a man who had been taught by war to save motion, save words, save mercy for the exact moment it might still matter. He moved toward Marin with measured steps, not fast, not slow. Behind him, Orion came up from the floor in one smooth motion. The shepherd's gray-cream coat caught the diner light like winter fur under moonshine. He did not bark. He did not show teeth. He simply placed himself where space ended and warning began. His ears were upright, his body angled forward, his amber eyes fixed not with panic, but with professional certainty. Orion did not look like a pet suddenly startled. He looked like a partner answering a silent command that had been practiced until it no longer needed sound. That was what changed Moss first. The broad man had been grinning when Talon stood, but now the grin faltered at the edges. Bullies understood rage. They understood fear even better. Calm was harder for them. Calm gave them nothing to hook into. Marin needs room, Talon said. His voice was low and even. It did not rise to fill the diner. It did not need to. Step back. Moss glanced at Deke as if waiting to see whether he was still allowed to find this funny. Deke Harlan kept one gloved hand hanging loose by his side. Up close, his face looked even colder than it had from across the room. Narrow cheeks, pale skin, thin mouth, eyes the color of a frozen pond under cloud. He was the sort of man who had trained himself to speak softly, because men who spoke softly were often underestimated until it was too late. "And who," Deke asked, "are you supposed to be?" Talon did not answer the question. He kept his gaze on Deke, not because Moss wasn't dangerous, but because experienced men learned quickly where a room's real center of gravity lived. "The man asking you once," Talon said, "before this gets uglier than you planned." Something in the diner shifted at that. Not relief. Not yet. Relief was too fragile for a room that had been living inside someone else's intimidation for too long. But the silence changed shape. It stopped being the silence of people shrinking and became the silence of people watching. Marin stood half-turned between Talon and her father, still breathing too shallowly, one hand gripping the edge of the counter hard enough that the knuckles had gone pale. Up close, she seemed younger than before and older too, the strange contradiction of people burdened early. Her auburn hair had loosened more from its tie, and one curl clung near her cheek, where heat and stress had dampened the skin. Shame burned hot across her face, but beneath it, Talon saw something else returning to her as well. Orientation. The simple human steadiness of not being alone in a moment that was trying to crush her. Elias Bell stood a few feet behind her, one hand pressed discreetly to his chest again, though discreetly no longer fooled anybody. His thin shoulders had a defeated slope that years of hard work and worry had carved into them, but his eyes still carried a father's stubbornness. He looked at Talon the way drowning men sometimes looked at distant shore, wanting to trust it, afraid to. Ritter laughed once, but there was less confidence in it now. "Look at this," he said. "Hero season already?" Orion took one step forward, not a lunge, not a threat any sheriff could call reckless, just one exact step. Ritter stopped laughing. The dog's restraint was somehow more unnerving than aggression would have been. It suggested judgment. It suggested training. It suggested a line invisible to everyone else but utterly clear to him. Moss shifted his weight and looked down at Orion with the forced contempt of a man trying to hide a flicker of uncertainty. "That thing bites?" Talon's answer came without hurry. "Only if I fail to be clear." For the first time, Wade Mercer pushed back from his stool. He did not stand all the way. Not yet. But the heavy trucker's boots planted flat on the floor, and both hands left his coffee mug. His weathered face had gone red around the cheeks, not with anger alone but with embarrassment. The embarrassment of a decent man who had recognized himself sitting still in a moment that demanded more. Lena Foss closed her paperback carefully and laid it on the table beside her tea. She was not a large woman, not dramatic in any visible way, but age had sharpened her into something more durable than softness. The retired schoolteacher's silver hair was pinned neatly back, and her lined face held the controlled displeasure of someone who had spent decades watching children test boundaries and knew exactly what rot took root when bad behavior was left uncorrected. Her gaze moved from Talon to Deke to Marin, and whatever private calculations she made ended with her spine lengthening against the booth. Deke noticed. Of course he noticed. Men like him survived by reading surrender the way hunters read tracks. "You don't know what you're stepping into," he said to Talon. Talon's expression barely changed. "I don't need the whole map to recognize a man using fear like a crowbar." That landed harder than a shout. Wade looked up fully now. Near the door, the young office-faced husband from earlier straightened in his booth, and this time his wife did not stop him. Even the woman with the little girl who had gone rigid with protective dread lifted her chin a fraction, as if remembering that witnessing was not the same as helplessness. It happened just like that, Talon thought. Evil was rarely strongest because it was brilliant. Usually it was strongest because everybody else kept checking the exits and hoping someone more qualified would arrive first. Deke read the room and understood he was losing the easiest version of this encounter. He gave the smallest tilt of his head. Moss stepped back first, slow enough to imply choice. Ritter followed with more resentment than grace. Marin let out a breath she seemed surprised to discover she had been holding. For a second, Talon thought the thing might end there. Not resolved, not clean, but paused. A tactical retreat. The kind men like Deke chose when they realized spectacle was no longer useful. Then Deke smiled. It was almost courteous. "That's the trouble with strangers," he said. "They walk into a place warm for 10 minutes and decide they understand the weather." No one answered. Snow hissed against the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, a forgotten timer buzzed once and stopped. Deke looked beyond Talon, over his shoulder, to Elias. "You know what this is really about. You always did." Elias's face changed. It was slight, almost too slight to catch, but Talon caught it. The old man's eyes did not widen in confusion or outrage. They darkened with recognition, not of the men, of the subject. The sentence had found an old wound by memory, not surprise. Marin turned at once. "Dad?" Elias swallowed. "It's nothing." Deke let the lie sit in the air a moment before speaking again. "There are families in this county who learned a long time ago that standing in the way of larger plans gets expensive." Wade rose then, fully this time. He was not graceful about it. His knees protested, his jacket bunched around his shoulders, and he looked more like a truck driver deciding he was too old to keep disappointing himself than any kind of storybook ally. But there he was, upright. "That's enough," Wade said. His voice was gravelly and blunt. "You got business with the bells. Take it somewhere it belongs, not in front of everybody trying to eat." Deke glanced at him, and for a brief second, contempt gave way to irritation. Men like Wade were inconvenient because they were not trying to perform morality. They were simply tired of swallowing it. Then Marin said, very softly, "I know you." The room stilled again. She was staring not at Deke, but at Ritter. Color had drained from her face, leaving her freckles faint against winter-pale skin. Her eyes were wide not with present fear alone, but with memory arriving too fast. Ritter's smirk flickered. Marin took one step backward. "You were here before." Ritter opened his mouth, but she kept going, the words coming as if they had been waiting behind some locked interior door for years. "The winter my mother died," she said. "You came in with a man in a dark green coat. I remember because you knocked over the sugar jar and laughed when I tried to clean it." No one moved. Even Orion's stillness deepened, as though the dog sensed something sacred and terrible had entered the room. Truth, not yet proven, but alive. Ritter's pale face hardened. "You were a kid." "I remember your laugh," Marin said. And just like that, the moment stopped being only about humiliation and became something else. Something colder and older than the afternoon storm. Deke turned his head slowly toward Ritter. It was not a look of surprise. It was a look of warning. That told Talon more than words would have. Marin's hand had gone to the small metal pendant at her throat, the one she wore beneath her apron, hidden most of the time, touching skin like a private prayer. She looked shaken now, but she did not look mistaken. Some memories lived in the body more fiercely than in language. A sound, a face, the wrong man in the wrong doorway on the wrong winter day. Elias made a low sound in his throat, nearly a groan. "Marin," he said, "don't." She turned on him then, hurt flashing through her voice more than anger. "Don't tell me I imagined it." "I didn't say that." But he hadn't denied it either. Talon saw it happen in real time. The daughter realizing her father knew more than he had ever admitted. The father realizing there would be no gentler season in which to keep his silence. The room realizing this diner's trouble had roots. Deke drew his gloves tighter. His calm had not vanished, but it had changed flavor. He no longer looked like a man amusing himself. He looked like a man calculating exposure. "This conversation," he said, "is done." "Then leave," Talon replied. For one dangerous second, Moss looked as if he might decide on force after all. His thick shoulders bunched. His eyes dropped again to Orion, then returned to Talon, measuring. But the arithmetic had gone bad for them. Too many witnesses now. Too much attention. Too much uncertainty about who Talon was and what he might do if touched. Deke made the choice. He gave the faintest gesture toward the door. Ritter went first, jaw tight, saying nothing. Moss followed with a muttered curse he did not finish aloud. Deke paused only long enough to look at Elias one last time. "Storms uncover strange things," he said quietly. "Be careful what you let thaw." Then he turned and walked out into the white roar beyond the glass. The door shut behind them with a hard clap. For a moment, nobody in the diner moved. Then everything human came back all at once. A woman exhaled shakily. Silverware clicked. Wade sat down like a man whose legs had remembered their age. The little girl near the window asked her mother in a whisper if the bad men were gone now. Somewhere in the kitchen, the old refrigerator motor hummed on as if nothing sacred or terrible had happened at all. Marin's strength left her so suddenly she had to brace herself against the booth nearest the counter. She did not sob. It was not that kind of collapse. It was quieter, more exhausted. The collapse of someone who had spent too long holding dignity in both hands while others treated it like sport. Elias crossed to her at once, slower than he wanted to go. "Honey," she flinched, not from him, but from the word. "You knew him," she said, voice thin. "Or something. You knew something." Elias looked 20 years older in that instant. "Marin, not here." "Then where?" Talon did not stay close enough to make himself part of the family's pain. That was another habit the military had left him. Step in when needed. Step back when the center of the wound belongs to others. He returned to his booth without ceremony, sat down, reached for his coffee, now nearly cold. The whole thing might have looked anticlimactic to people who had never seen real courage. He was not interested in looking like the hero of anyone's memory. Wade turned halfway on his stool. "You military?" "Used to be." "Figures." Lena, still seated, studied Talon over the rim of her tea. "You have the posture of a man who learned the cost of waiting too long." Talon gave the smallest shrug. Sometimes waiting is the cost. She seemed to accept that answer more than most people would have. At the counter, Marin was wiping her face with the heel of her hand, furious at tears she had not invited. Her father hovered beside her uselessly, carrying worry like a lantern with no oil left in it. Then Orion, who had remained standing through the whole aftermath, turned away from the door. He did not return to Talon's feet. Instead, he walked toward the narrow passage beside the counter and stopped near the back hall leading toward the storage room. His body went still again, but this was a different stillness than before. Focused, listening through scent, through old wood, through whatever had caught his working mind. He lowered his head slightly, nostrils drawing in once. Then he looked back, not at the room, not at the strangers, but directly at Talon. Not urgent, not panicked, certain. Talon felt the look land in him like a tap on an old locked door. Something had shifted, not solved, not revealed, but shifted. Outside, the storm kept whitening the highway, erasing tracks as fast as men could make them. Inside Blue Lantern Diner, another kind of weather had begun. The diner did not become peaceful after Deke Harlan and his men left. It became quieter than peace. That was worse. Outside, the storm thickened again. Snow moved across the darkening highway in long white sheets, swallowing tire tracks almost as soon as they were made. The trucks in the lot had turned into hulking shapes under fresh accumulation, their windshields gone blind beneath ice and powder. Every few minutes, the bell above the door gave a faint, nervous rattle when the wind struck the building hard enough. Inside Blue Lantern Diner, the heat still held, but warmth was no longer simple. People spoke in lower voices now. Cups touched saucers with a care that had not been there earlier. The room had the strange intimacy that follows fear, the kind that leaves strangers feeling briefly connected, not because they know one another, but because they have witnessed the same crack opening under ordinary life. Talon Voss returned to his booth without ceremony, though his attention never fully left the room. He sat with one hand around a coffee cup that had long since gone lukewarm. At 44, he had learned that adrenaline did not always leave a place when danger stepped out the door. Sometimes it stayed in the wood, the air, the faces of those who had almost broken and now had to decide what shape to take after not breaking. His burnt orange canvas coat was still on, open over the gray sweater, as if some part of him refused to settle too far into comfort. The old military watch on his wrist caught the diner light when he lifted his cup. His face looked harder in the quiet than it had during confrontation, not because he was angry, but because silence let old thoughts return. He had never trusted moments that came right after trouble. They always asked too much from the nervous system. Calm had to be rebuilt. It did not simply arrive. Orion stood near the side passage instead of returning to the booth. The dog's gray cream coat had dried enough to fluff slightly along the shoulders, though melted snow still darkened the fur at his legs. He held himself with that same trained composure, ears alert, tail low, body quiet, but not at rest. His amber eyes did not keep checking the front door. Instead, they moved toward the back of the diner, toward the narrower dark beyond the counter, where the hall ran past the pantry and storage room. Marin had noticed it too. She was behind the register now, trying to put the room back together with the same determined hands she used to refill mugs and clear plates. But the tremor had not fully left her. Her auburn hair, loosened from the long afternoon, escaped in tired strands around her face. Her cheeks had lost their earlier flush and settled into that pale winter tone that made her look younger and more exhausted at once. Every few minutes she looked toward her father as if checking whether he might disappear if she stopped. Elias Bell was back in the kitchen because men of his generation often mistook motion for strength. At 68, he looked thinner than ever in the bright kitchen light, his flannel shirt hanging looser than it should have over his frame. He moved carefully now, one hand on the edge of the counter more often than before, but pride kept his chin lifted. The trouble with good men who had hidden fear for years was that the habit hardened into posture. Wade Mercer had moved from the counter stool to a booth closer to the middle of the room, as if unwilling to drift too far back into the safe anonymity he'd occupied before. He was a large man with a trucker's heaviness in his shoulders and a weather-beaten face softened by decency rather than sentiment. He kept rubbing the back of his neck with one broad hand, the embarrassed gesture of someone replaying his own silence and not liking what he saw. Lena Foss remained exactly where she had been, but the atmosphere around her had changed. She was no longer simply a retired teacher waiting out weather with tea and a paperback. She had become what certain older women become in small towns during moments of moral weather. Witness, memory, standard. Her silver hair remained neat, her cardigan buttoned, but her eyes had sharpened. She was looking not merely at what had happened, but at what it meant. "It wasn't random," Wade said at last. Nobody in the diner pretended not to know what he meant. He leaned forward, forearms on the table. "I've been driving this route near 30 years. Seen drunks, road fights, stupid men acting tough because winter makes everybody feel mean. That wasn't that." "No," Lena said softly. "It wasn't." Her voice carried the dry confidence of a woman accustomed to being right more often than people enjoyed. "Those men have been around before." Marin looked up sharply. "Here?" Lena wrapped both hands around her teacup. "Not always inside, but around. At the gas station, across from the post office, parked near the county road turnoff. Men who behave as though they're waiting for paperwork to become permission." That sentence settled into the room like a weight. Talon said nothing. He was listening the way he always listened, quietly, without seeming to ask for anything. It was one of the reasons people talked near him more easily than they intended to. He did not crowd their words. He let them arrive. Marin wiped the same spot on the counter twice before she noticed. "My father never said anything," she murmured. Elias answered from the kitchen without turning around. "There are a lot of things I didn't want in your head. That doesn't mean they weren't already there." The words came sharper than she meant them to, and the immediate guilt on her face almost broke the sentence in half. But Elias did not scold her. He only stood still for a moment, shoulders bent slightly beneath something older than the storm. The radio crackled from a shelf near the pie case. Then came the county traffic advisory in a voice so calm it sounded unreal. Roads northbound partially closed until morning, visibility dropping after sundown. Drivers advised to shelter in place where possible. Wade exhaled. "Well, that settles that." Talon glanced toward the frosted windows. He had already known he was staying. The storm had made the choice before the radio confirmed it. Still, hearing it spoken aloud changed the feeling of the place. Blue Lantern Diner was no longer merely a stop. For the night, it was a held space, a bowl of light in a landscape erasing edges. Elias came out from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee and looked at Talon with a weariness that tried not to become pleading. "Road's not opening," he said. "You and the dog can stay a while longer, at least until the wind settles some." Talon gave a brief nod. "Appreciate it." Marin looked at him then, not with gratitude alone, but with the strange, searching uncertainty people sometimes brought to those who arrived at the right moment. As if fate might have slipped into a man-shaped outline and sat down at booth 7 with a winter coat and old scars. Talon knew that look. He never liked it. It asked him to stand for things no human being could reliably be. He looked away first. Orion moved. Without any signal from Talon, the shepherd left the narrow hall and crossed behind the counter with the quiet certainty of an animal following a thread only he could feel. He lowered his nose to the worn wooden floor near a shelf stacked with canned goods and paper napkins. Then he stopped at one particular board and stood utterly still, not sniffing wildly, not scratching in excitement, just standing over it, ears forward, head lowered, as if listening through scent to something beneath the wood. The room fell silent again. Marin stared. Wade half rose from his booth. Even Lena's careful hands tightened around her cup. Then Orion pawed once, lightly, almost politely, against the board. And Elias Bell went white. It was not a subtle change. Color drained from his face so quickly it seemed some hidden hand had reached in and pulled the blood from him. For one terrible second he looked older than age, like a man who had been recognized by the past. No one spoke. Talon's gaze moved from the dog to the old man, and in that line of sight something invisible clicked into place. Not an answer. A door. Talon stood and walked slowly to where Orion waited. He did not crouch immediately. He had learned never to rush a dog working from instinct and training in the same breath. Orion had a particular stillness when something mattered. Not mere curiosity, but focus. Talon knew every shade of that posture the way some men knew their own handwriting. "What is it?" Marin whispered. Talon looked at the board, then at Elias. "That depends," he said, "on whether your father already knows." Elias gripped the coffee pot so tightly his knuckles blanched against the handle. "It's old flooring," he said too quickly. "This place has been patched 100 times." Orion did not move. Talon crouched at last and ran his fingers along the edge of the board. The wood was worn smooth by years of footsteps, but one side had a nearly invisible difference in grain and dust pattern. Lifted before, replaced. Not recently, but not never. He leaned in, drawing a breath. There it was. Not much. A fading trace. Damp earth, oil, rust. The cold smell of something metal kept too long in a hidden place. It had mingled with old wood and kitchen heat so thoroughly that a person would never have separated it from the rest. But Orion had. Talon straightened. "You don't have to explain it," he said to Elias, voice calm. "But don't lie about what's under there." Marin turned to her father, all the hurt of the past hour sharpening into something more dangerous than fear. "Dad?" Elias looked at his daughter, and whatever he saw in her face ended the last of his resistance. This was not a theatrical surrender, no shaking confession, no convenient collapse into honesty. It was smaller, sadder, and more believable than that. It looked like a tired man understanding that the wall he had leaned against for years had finally rotted through. He set the coffee pot down carefully on the counter. "Lock the front door," he said. Marin blinked. "What?" "Just do it." She obeyed without argument, crossing the diner on stiff legs to turn the latch. Outside, snow drove past the glass in pale waves. Wade stood. "You want us to go?" Elias shook his head. "No. Maybe it's time somebody besides family knew." That sentence changed the room more than any threat had. Lena rose from her booth with slow dignity and came closer. Wade followed, awkward but steady. The young mother with the little girl gathered her things and left quietly after a glance toward Marin that held sympathy rather than fear. The couple by the wall also slipped out, Not cowardly this time, just wise enough to recognize when a story was becoming too private and too dangerous for casual presence. That left the diner smaller, more intimate, more honest. Elias knelt by the board with visible effort. His hands shook as he reached under the lower shelf and pressed at something hidden in shadow. A soft internal click answered him. Then he pried up the plank. Marin made a sound too small to be called a gasp. Beneath the floor sat a flat tin box wrapped in an old dish towel yellowed with age. Elias lifted it out, as if it weighed far more than metal should. For a moment he only held it on his knees, looking at it, not opening it. Talon understood that too. Objects could absorb time. Some became heavier each year you refused to touch them. "Your mother wanted me to burn this," Elias said at last, though his eyes were still on the box and not on Marin. "Then she wanted me to keep it. Then she died before either choice could save us." Marin went very still. The room itself seemed to brace. When Elias opened the box, there was no dramatic music, no cinematic miracle, only the blunt terror of ordinary things preserved too long. A folded property map with county markings along the lakeshore. Several old sales agreements, carbon copies of typed letters, a photograph taken in winter, a section of snow-covered shoreline, a truck near the pines, two men too far from the camera to identify clearly, a handful of receipts stained by age, and beneath those, an envelope with no stamp, addressed in a woman's hand. Marin knew the handwriting before Elias said anything. She reached for the envelope and then stopped just short of touching it, as though the paper itself might burn. "My mother wrote that?" Elias nodded once. His face was no longer pale with shock. It had settled into something more desolate, the look of a man who had spent years mistaking concealment for protection and now had to watch both fail in the same moment. "She thought the land behind us was the real reason," he said. "Not the diner itself. This corner here," he tapped the map with one worn finger. "This stretch by the road and the access line toward the lake. She believed somebody wanted the Bell property because it connected the main route to the back parcels, easier to move equipment, easier to claim expansion, easier to make it all sound legal." Wade bent over the map, squinting. "This goes right toward the North Shore Strip." Lena's mouth tightened. "Which half the county has been whispering about since autumn." Marin finally picked up the envelope. She opened it with trembling care and unfolded the single sheet inside. Her eyes moved down the page, and Talon watched grief arrive in stages. First confusion, then recognition, then the deeper wound, the realization that events you once called separate losses had been touching each other in secret the whole time. "What does it say?" Wade asked quietly. Marin swallowed before answering. She wrote that men had come twice asking about the road access behind the diner. She said they were polite the first time, less polite the second. She said if anything happened, Dad wasn't to trust anyone who kept talking about progress while refusing to say who it was for. Silence followed that. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of pattern. Talon looked over the documents without touching them. He did not need every detail yet to understand the shape of what lay before them. This was not a random campaign of intimidation by local thugs amusing themselves in winter. This was pressure with memory, pressure with paperwork, pressure arranged by people who preferred signatures and exhaustion to open violence, because signatures survived courtrooms better than bruises. Marin lowered the letter and stared at her father. All these years, she said, her voice hollowed by disbelief. You knew there was more. Elias's eyes shone but did not spill. I knew there was enough to be afraid. That's not the same thing. No, he said, it isn't. Outside, the storm kept moving over the highway, like history trying to erase its own tracks. Inside Blue Lantern Diner, with the tin box open on the floorboards, and Orion standing nearby like a quiet witness sent by some stern and merciful power, the story Marin Bell had believed about her family's life was no longer one story. It was several stories, tied together by paper, silence, and winter. And Talon, feeling old instincts wake in the colder chambers of his mind, understood one thing with absolute clarity. This had not started tonight. Morning came slowly over the northern town, as if even daylight had to push through resistance. The storm had weakened, but it had not truly passed. Snow still fell in thin, wind-blown sheets, whitening the edges of fences, trucks, roofs, and pine branches that already carried too much winter on their backs. The world outside Blue Lantern Diner looked almost painfully beautiful. The frozen lake in the distance held a pale silver sheen beneath the gray sky, and the low buildings of the town crouched under their white burdens, like tired animals waiting for spring. Talon Voss stood by the diner window with a fresh cup of coffee warming one hand and watched the road beyond the lot. He could have left. State plows had opened part of the highway, and the advisory had shifted from closed to limited travel. If he'd been the man he had taught himself to be these last few years, efficient, detached, loyal only to the contract waiting at the end of the road, he would have thanked the bells, loaded Orion into the truck, and put the diner in his rearview mirror before the morning lost its first light. But something in him refused that easy exit. It was not sentiment. Talon mistrusted sentiment when it arrived too early. He had seen too many people mistake emotion for clarity. What held him there was colder and more exact. A pattern had begun to show itself, and men like him learned long ago that patterns were rarely accidents. The Bell family had not simply been unlucky. Pressure had been applied to them before. Pressure had a history, and history, when it wanted to stay hidden, often dressed itself as coincidence. Orion sat near the door, tall and composed, his gray cream coat bright against the darker tile floor. At 5 years old, the German Shepherd had long ago grown into the kind of stillness most dogs never learned. He was not lazy. He was deliberate. His ears remained high. His amber eyes tracked the room in quiet sweeps. He had eaten, drunk water, and rested. But there was a reserve in him this morning, a subtle readiness that told Talon the dog had not filed the previous night away as finished business. Behind the counter, Marin Bell moved through the early shift with the brittle determination of someone trying to behave normally in a world that had stopped deserving normal. Her auburn hair was pulled back again, but exhaustion shadowed her hazel brown eyes more openly now. She had crossed some line overnight. She no longer looked like a girl merely protecting the family business. She looked like a daughter staring at the ruins of a story she had believed since childhood. Elias Bell worked more slowly than usual, though he kept trying to hide it. He stood in the kitchen doorway, with one hand braced on the frame, his thin shoulders curved, his flannel shirt hanging loose on a body that had once been stronger than it was allowed to remain. Shame sat on him heavily, not the shame of guilt, but the older shame of a good man who had tried to protect his family through silence, and now feared the silence had done more damage than the truth. Marin carried Talon's refill to the booth and set it down without quite meeting his eyes. "You should probably keep going," she said after a moment. Talon looked at her. "That what you want?" "No." The answer came too fast. She swallowed. "That's what would make sense." He took a sip of coffee. Sense and timing don't always share a house. A tired, unwilling smile touched one corner of her mouth. "That sounds like something someone says after making a bad decision. Usually right before." That earned him a real breath of laughter, brief and fragile as a match in wind. When it faded, she leaned one hand on the table. "She wasn't dramatic, my mother," Marin said quietly. "People remember that wrong when someone dies. They start rewriting them into saints or prophets. My mother was practical, stubborn, the kind of woman who saved rubber bands in a kitchen drawer because you never knew when one would be useful. But when men started sniffing around the lake parcels, she got sharp about it, like she could hear something under their words." Talon listened without interrupting. "She used to say the land wasn't just land," Marin went on. "That people from outside always talked about what a place was worth, but never what it was made of. They saw shoreline, roads, permits, access points. She saw old docks, fishing seasons, the families that heated with wood because fuel costs got ugly in January, kids learning to skate on the shallows when the ice was right. She said greed was most dangerous when it learned how to wear paperwork." Talon looked down at the folded documents from the tin box spread neatly on the booth beside him. Property maps, carbon copies, receipts, fragments of pressure. Not enough to convict anyone. Enough to disturb a man who knew how organized intimidation usually looked once it matured. "What about the accident?" he asked. Marin's face tightened. "The sheriff called it weather. My father called it weather. Everybody called it weather because winter makes a perfect alibi. The road was bad. The slope was icy. The truck slid. End of story." She paused, her fingers tightening on the table edge. "But I remember my mother arguing with someone 2 nights before she died. She thought I was asleep." "Your father know who?" He never said. From the kitchen, Elias turned away as though the sentence itself had touched him. Wade Mercer, who had stayed through breakfast on the excuse that the roads were still ugly farther west, slid into the opposite booth after asking with his eyes and getting a nod from Talon. In daylight, Wade looked even more like a man built by roads and weather. Thick wrists, heavy shoulders, a broad face mapped with creases left by squinting into glare and snow for decades. He had the manner of a man who rarely spoke before deciding whether speaking would do any good. "I remember equipment trucks," Wade said. "Maybe 10, 12 years back. Running late at night toward the old North Lake track. Didn't make sense then. Makes a little more now." Lena Foss joined them soon after, carrying her tea like a woman entering a faculty meeting she never intended to let collapse into foolishness. She sat carefully, cardigan neat, silver hair pinned, every inch of her expressing the kind of disciplined intelligence that small towns often overlooked until they badly needed it. "There were county arguments that winter," she said. "Nothing open enough to make headlines. Just measurements, access lines, land use revisions. Men talking about opportunity in voices too polished for people who had ever had to thaw their own pipes." Her mouth thinned. "And there were strangers in town more often than there should have been." Talon took all of it in. Rumor, memory, fragments. Useful, but still soft. He needed harder edges. Around late morning, Sheriff June Caraway came in with snow crusted along the shoulders of her olive coat and cold in her eyes. She was 52, straight-backed, with a face that had sharpened instead of softened with age. Her hair, brown-streaked heavily with gray, was cut blunt at the jaw. She moved like a woman who had learned long ago that authority in a small town could not be performed. It had to be carried. June had the look of someone who had spent years being underestimated by men who mistook calm for weakness and later regretted the lesson. She took off her gloves one finger at a time and looked first at Elias, then at Marin, then at Talon. "Heard there was trouble here yesterday," she said. "Depends who you ask," Wade muttered. June ignored that. "I'm asking the people involved." Marin told her enough to be useful without spilling the box under the floor in front of half the diner. Deke, the harassment, the threats, the mention of papers. June listened without once glancing at her notebook, though she took notes anyway. Her expression hardly changed. Only when Deke's name came up did something older pass briefly through her face. "You know him," Talon said. June capped her pen. "I know the type." "That's not what I asked." For a moment the sheriff studied him. Then she gave the smallest nod. "I know he works for people who prefer distance," she said. "The kind who keep their shoes clean while others do the knocking." "Then why's he still walking around?" "Because suspicion isn't evidence." Her tone stayed level, but fatigue lived beneath it. "And because money learns how to sit inside procedure. If you move too early, it survives you." That answer satisfied no one, but it sounded true. As June stood to leave, her gaze dropped to the folded property map on the booth seat beside Talon. She froze. It lasted no more than a second, yet everyone at the table felt it. Then she reached out and touched one marked corner of the map. Not casually, not curiously, but like someone recognizing a scar on a body she had once tried to save. "This line," she said quietly. "This access point was removed from county display copies years ago." The room went still. Marin stared at her. "Removed by who?" June lifted her eyes, and for the first time since entering the diner, the sheriff looked less like law and more like a woman standing at the edge of an old grave. "That," she said, "is the kind of question that gets answered slowly if you want to keep breathing while it does." Then she took her hand away from the map and walked out into the white morning, leaving behind a silence that felt larger than the diner walls. By noon, Talon had decided memory alone was no longer enough. If the Bell family had been pressured through land access and paperwork, the county records office would be the first place Rott had learned to file itself neatly. Marin insisted on going with him. Elias objected, then failed to produce a reason strong enough to keep her behind. In the end, Talon drove, Orion in the back seat, Marin beside him with a folder clutched too tightly in both hands. The county building sat in the center of town, a low brick structure with a plowed front walk and a flag hanging stiff in the cold. Inside, the heating was too dry and the fluorescent lights too honest. The records office smelled faintly of dust, toner, and old folders. Nora Pike worked behind the main counter. She was in her mid-40s, small and carefully dressed, with a taupe cardigan over a white blouse and a narrow gray skirt that suggested a life built around order. Her brownish-ash hair was pinned back low at the neck, and thin silver-framed glasses magnified pale gray eyes that did not like staying on any face too long. She had the look of a woman who had spent years living politely beneath louder people's decisions. Nothing about her was dramatic, but worry seemed to sit in her shoulders the way snow sat on gutters. Light at first glance, dangerous if it built long enough. She recognized Marin immediately. "Marin Bell," Nora's voice was quiet, papery. "I didn't expect to see you today." "I need help," Marin said. Nora's gaze shifted to Talon, then to Orion waiting just outside the doorway, visible through the glass panel. The dog sat perfectly still, fur bright against the snow, looking like both guardian and accusation. "What kind of help?" Talon laid out only the documents that mattered least if someone else saw them. Receipts, carbon copies, one map copy, no letter. Enough to ask questions. Not enough to lose everything if the wrong eyes appeared. Nora read in silence for a long time. Her fingers were elegant and tense, moving carefully from page to page. Twice she glanced toward the hallway behind her, where county offices stretched deeper into the building. When she finally spoke, her voice had become thinner. "These transaction chains," she said, tapping one page, "aren't clean." Marin leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means property moved through hands too fast. Parcels transferred under shell names, then folded into development umbrellas before local objections could organize. That can happen legally." She paused. "It can also happen because somebody knows exactly where to apply pressure." "Do you know who?" Talon asked. Nora hesitated so long that silence became its own confession. Then she opened a drawer and took out a ledger copy, old enough that the paper had begun to yellow at the edges. "There's one name that keeps surfacing around the reorganizations," she said softly. "Not always as buyer, not always as attorney on record, but near enough to every change to leave a shadow." She slid the page across. Clint Duvall. Marin read the name twice as if repetition might make it less real. "Who is he?" Nora gave a brittle breath that was almost a laugh and not at all amused. "A lawyer. A very careful one. Tall, polished, all dark suits and silver cufflinks. The kind of man who makes ordinary theft sound like civic progress. He never raises his voice. He never needs to. Men like Deke Harlan make noise for him farther down the chain." "And you never said anything?" Marin asked. Nora's face changed then, not into guilt alone, but into the exhausted self-contempt of someone who had spent years measuring risk and calling it prudence. "I said what could be said safely," she replied. "That's the truth I'm least proud of." They left with copies, not certainty, but certainty had begun to grow teeth. That evening, after the diner closed early and Elias checked the lock twice, the air inside felt stretched thin. Talon took the back stool near the kitchen door. Orion lay across the rear threshold, not asleep, just anchored there. Marin counted the register in distracted motions. Elias washed the same saucepan for too long. The sound came after dark, a sudden crack of glass from the back. Marin gasped. Elias spun. Orion was up before the last shard hit the floor. Talon reached the rear door in 3 strides and found the lower pane of the back window shattered inward. On the linoleum, among glittering fragments, lay a rock wrapped with a strip of paper held in place by black tape. He picked it up and unwrapped it. 3 words, block printed in ink. Let it stay buried. No one in the room pretended any longer. This was not posturing, not random harassment. Someone knew the ground was shifting beneath them and had chosen fear as mortar. They cleaned up the glass, boarded the lower pane, turned off most of the lights. But sleep that night was shallow and defensive. Talon stayed in his clothes. Near dawn, Orion stood, not sharply, not with alarm, with certainty. The dog moved to the back door, nose low, then looked once at Talon. That was enough. Talon opened the door into the blue-gray hour before sunrise. Fresh snow covered the yard behind the diner in an almost unbroken sheet. Almost. Tracks. A single set, leaving the back window and cutting toward the tree line beyond the plowed edge of the lot. Orion took the scent at once and moved forward, muscles quiet and intent. Talon followed with a flashlight. Marin, pale and stubborn in her winter boots and coat, came after them before he could stop her. The tracks led behind the diner, across a narrow dip in the land, and toward an overgrown path Talon would have missed in full daylight if not shown where to look. The old trail opened toward a weather-leaning lakeside shed half buried in snow. Its boards were warped. Rusted fuel drums sat beside it like old sentries. The frozen lake beyond lay pale and enormous under first light. Orion went straight to the side wall where drifted snow had piled against rotting planks. He began to paw, not frantically, but with the same controlled insistence he'd shown under the diner floor. Talon knelt and cleared snow with his hands, until wood gave way to a small metal latch hidden beneath debris. Inside, lodged in a waterproof case under broken boards and oil-stained cloth, lay a cassette tape, several photographs of vehicle plates, and a duplicate survey map marked in red by a woman's careful hand. Marin stared at the handwriting. "That's hers," she whispered. There was no miracle in the moment. Only winter. Evidence. A dog that followed what humans had ignored. And 3 people standing in the cold where someone years ago had hidden truth in the hope that one day fear might weaken enough for it to be found. By the time the cassette was restored enough to play, the afternoon light had gone the color of cold metal. The repair itself was humble, almost laughably so for something that carried the weight of years. Wade Mercer knew a mechanic 2 blocks over who still kept old equipment in a back room because he distrusted the idea that newer always meant better. The man's name was Harold Sutter, a stooped, heavy-browed widower in his 60s with nicotine-yellowed fingers, a square jaw softened by grief, and the patient hands of someone who had spent a lifetime coaxing stubborn machines back into usefulness. He wore grease-dark overalls over a thermal shirt and had the manner of a man who no longer wasted words on drama. He cleaned the cassette, adjusted the cracked shell, and said only, "If there's a voice on this, it's going to come through thin. Listen hard." So they did. Back at Blue Lantern Diner, the old cassette player sat on the counter beside the register like an artifact from another century, its plastic yellowed, its buttons sticky with age. Snow still hissed past the windows, though the storm had weakened into a fine white drift. The diner itself seemed to lean inward around the machine. Marin stood with both hands flat on the counter, as though steadying herself against a wave only she could feel. Her auburn hair had loosened again, a few tired strands brushing her cheeks. She looked pale, but not fragile. There was something altered in her now. Grief had sharpened into purpose. She no longer carried herself like someone waiting to be protected. She looked like someone who had finally found the door to a locked room and was willing to step inside no matter what waited there. Elias Bell stood beside her, thinner than winter ought to allow, one hand pressed lightly to the counter edge. His face, lined and gentle by nature, seemed hollowed by dread. For years he had lived as if silence were a shelter. Now he was discovering that silence, left too long, became a cellar. Talon Voss remained slightly apart, leaning one hip against the far booth, arms folded loosely over his broad chest. He still wore his burnt orange canvas coat open over the gray sweater, as though part of him remained prepared to step into weather at any moment. His face was set in that disciplined calm of his, but his gray-blue eyes missed nothing. Orion sat at his side, the gray-cream German shepherd tall and motionless, ears raised, gaze moving between the people and the machine, with the solemn alertness of a creature who sensed that whatever emerged would not be ordinary sound. Wade stood near the pie case, hat in both hands. Lena Foss sat upright at a booth, silver hair pinned back, spine like a ruler, her tea untouched. Sheriff June Caraway had come back in plain clothes under her olive coat, as if she knew instinctively that this would not feel like a formal interview. Her face was all angles and restraint, but there was a darkness in her eyes that suggested she had already spent years circling this truth without a way to pin it down. Harold pressed play. At first there was only static, then a click, then the voice of Marin's mother. It was not dramatic. That was the terrible thing. She sounded practical, composed, like a woman making a grocery list while trying not to frighten anyone in the kitchen. Her voice carried the crisp steadiness of someone who had long ago learned that panic made fools of honest people. "If you're hearing this," she said, "then I was right not to trust paper that moves faster than truth." Marin inhaled sharply, and Orion turned his head toward her. The woman on the tape continued. She spoke of trucks moving documents and materials between the lakeside parcels and an unregistered shed near the north access line. She named no one directly, but she described faces, times, patterns, and pressure. Men asking questions that were not really questions. Men talking about progress while watching the road behind the diner instead of the view. Men who wanted not just land, but connection, an access route, a final piece, a legal seam they could pull until the rest came apart. Then came the part that changed the room completely. "If something happens to me," her voice said, still calm, still almost unbearably calm, "Elias, don't let them have the diner. Not because of pride, because it is the hinge. If this property goes, the North Shore route opens clean, and once it opens clean, the rest of the families won't matter." No one moved. The tape hissed softly. Talon saw June's jaw tighten. Wade closed his eyes. Elias bowed his head as if the years had just reached up and taken hold of the back of his neck. The voice went on, gentler now. "Marin is too young to carry this. Let her have a childhood, if you still can." That broke something in Marin. Not loudly, not theatrically. A single tear escaped down one cheek, and she wiped it away with visible irritation, as if she had no patience left for her own body. June stepped closer to the counter. "That's not proof enough for court," she said quietly. "But it's enough for me to move faster than I have been." Elias looked up. "You believed her?" June gave him a long, tired look. "I believed something was wrong years ago. Belief isn't the same thing as leverage." Talon unfolded his arms. "Now you've got more than belief." June nodded once. "And now they'll know it." As if summoned by the sentence itself, Orion rose. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply stood and turned his head toward the front windows, his body going still in a way Talon knew better than language. Not alarm. Recognition. A moment later, through the veil of blowing snow, 3 shapes darkened the glass. Marin whispered, "No." The bell above the diner door rang, and Deke Harlan walked in smiling, like a man who believed timing was another form of ownership. Behind him came Moss and Ritter, broader and meaner in the failing light, snow stippling their shoulders. Deke had abandoned his earlier pretense of civility. The charcoal coat remained, but something in his posture had sharpened. He no longer looked amused. He looked efficient. Dangerous in the way men became when politeness had failed, and they meant to salvage control by fear. "You should really lock your door earlier," he said. Nobody answered him. That was the first surprise. The second came a heartbeat later, when Wade Mercer stood up before Talon moved. The trucker was not elegant. He rose with the heaviness of a man whose joints had learned every winter personally. But he stood, his broad shoulders squared, his big hands opened and closed once at his sides. "Not today," Wade said. Lena slid from her booth and came to stand beside Marin, one hand resting lightly against the younger woman's back. The gesture was so simple it nearly hurt to watch. It said, "You will not face this alone again." Near the door, the young man who had once hidden behind his wife's fear, now named by the town as Caleb Dunn, a slim mechanic's apprentice with sandy hair, nervous eyes, and the soft face of someone not yet old enough to know how quickly cowardice can become habit, lifted his phone and began recording. At the side hallway, Donna Vale, a sturdy middle-aged woman who ran the flower shop down the block and had come in for soup before closing up, moved without a word to lock the side entrance. She was broad-hipped, red-cheeked from the cold, with practical hands and the no-nonsense courage of women who had raised children, buried parents, and learned that decency sometimes required blunt force. Elias stepped from the kitchen. His hand trembled. His heart was still unreliable. Fear lived in his face. But he came anyway, stopping beside his daughter with his shoulders lifted as straight as age and guilt would allow. That, Talon thought, was resurrection in its plainest form. Deke's smile faltered when he saw the shape of the room. "This doesn't concern the audience," he said. Wade answered before anyone else could. "Funny. You brought a whole show last time." Moss started toward the counter, but Orion slid into motion with precise, liquid certainty, placing himself on a diagonal line that blocked the man's path to Marin. The shepherd's head was low, ears forward, body balanced perfectly over all four paws. He was not a wild animal. He was geometry. He made space dangerous without surrendering control. Talon moved then, not rushing, not posturing. He stepped where he needed to step, creating angles and limits, separating Deke from Marin, Moss from the back hall, Ritter from the register. Years of training lived in the economy of those choices. He understood distance the way musicians understood rhythm. Keep the center from collapsing. Deny momentum. Make violence inconvenient. "You're done here," Talon said. Deke's eyes flicked to the old cassette player on the counter, then to the map folder, then to June. Ah, Talon thought. There it is. The real reason for the visit. "They don't know what they're holding," Deke said. June answered this time. "I know enough." Ritter took a half step toward the register. Caleb raised his phone higher. Donna said, "Don't be stupid," with such flat conviction that even Ritter hesitated. The room had changed species. It was no longer prey. Deke tried one more tactic. "All of you think courage means standing close to trouble for 10 minutes, he said, voice low and smooth again. "But some of us have been building this for years." Marin met his eyes. Her face had gone white, but her voice did not shake. "That's exactly why it ends here." For one dangerous second, Moss lunged, not at Talon, but trying to cut around the end of the counter toward the folder. Orion intercepted without ever losing discipline. A sharp forward burst, a snap of movement that stopped short of contact, but forced Moss to recoil off balance. He slammed into a chair, cursing. The room exploded into motion. Talon caught Ritter's wrist before the man could grab the cassette player, twisted just enough to strip away leverage, and shoved him backward into the pie case. Deke retreated 2 steps, recalculating in real time. Elias sucked in a pained breath, but stayed upright. Wade moved in front of Marin like a barn wall. From outside came the crunch of tires. June had not come alone after all. 2 deputies burst through the front door, both broad in winter gear. One of them a young black deputy named Aaron Pike. Tall, clean-shaven, steady-eyed, with the contained tension of a man new enough to law enforcement to still believe procedure could matter if applied fast enough. The other, older and heavier, moved straight toward Moss. "Sheriff!" Aaron barked. Deke understood the balance had tipped. He moved first, pivoting for the door with Ritter close behind. Moss, swearing and winded, stumbled after them. June shouted. Deputies lunged. Wade shouted something unintelligible and furious. But Deke and Ritter made it into the whitening dusk. Talon was already moving. He did not ask permission. Orion was with him before the door finished swinging open. Cold hit like a thrown sheet of knives. Tracks cut fresh across the lot toward the road behind the diner, and then down toward the old lakeside access. Snow still drifted, but not enough yet to erase them. Orion took the line immediately, nose low, body straining forward with controlled intensity. Talon followed, boots pounding over packed white ground, breath slicing in his chest. Behind them came June and Deputy Aaron, farther back but gaining. The chase led past the back of the diner, through the stand of pines, and out toward the old dock by the frozen lake, a place where the world turned white and silver and mercilessly open. Wind screamed over the ice. The boards of the dock groaned beneath accumulated snow. Deke had chosen distance, perhaps hoping blank space would become escape. Instead, it became exposure. Ritter slipped first. His boots lost traction near the edge of the dock, and he crashed hard to one knee, cursing. Talon reached him 2 strides later and drove him flat with a shoulder and forearm, pinning him without flourish. Deke kept running. Orion veered, cut the angle, and got there before any human could. He did not attack. He planted himself between Deke and the narrow path back to shore, body rigid, teeth barely visible now, every line of him saying the same thing with perfect clarity. No farther. Deke froze. The lake behind him stretched out in frozen vastness, wind lifting snow across its surface in ghostly streamers. Talon came up breathing hard, face like carved stone. June arrived seconds later, weapon drawn but low, voice cold enough to match the air. "It's over." For the first time, Deke looked small. Not harmless, never that. But stripped. No office, no leverage, no room full of frightened townspeople. Just a man on a white dock with the truth finally catching up to the soles of his expensive boots. He raised his hands slowly. Behind them, over the ice and under the deep winter sky, the town's old darkness had nowhere left to hide. The snow did not stop all at once. It loosened. That was the first mercy. After the arrest at the dock, the storm thinned by degrees, as if the sky itself had grown tired of carrying so much white grief. By morning, the wind no longer screamed along the frozen lake. It only moved through the pines in long, cold breaths. The roads were still edged with drifts, the roofs still shouldered with snow, but the world had changed from punishment to aftermath. And aftermath, Talon Voss knew, was always the harder country. He stood outside Blue Lantern Diner just after dawn, one hand around a paper cup of coffee, watching pale light spread across the highway. At 44, he had learned that endings were rarely clean. Men were arrested, yes. Documents surfaced. Names began to shift from rumor into evidence. But fear did not disappear just because one man finally lost the ground beneath his boots. Fear lingered in habits, in lowered voices, in the long pause before a person decided whether to tell the truth this time. Still, something real had broken. Not the town, the silence around it. Behind him, through the front windows of the diner, he could see movement in warm gold light. Marin at the counter, Elias near the griddle, Orion turning once in a slow circle before settling near the door. The diner looked the way it had looked that first morning. Fogged windows, soft lamps, steam rising. But Talon knew it was not the same place anymore. Neither was he. In the 2 days that followed Deke Harlan's arrest, things began to move with the strange speed that came only after years of stillness. Sheriff June Carraway had not wasted the chance. She and Deputy Aaron Pike pulled files, interviewed frightened witnesses while courage was still warm, and secured copies of the documents before anyone above county level could make them disappear. Clint Duvall had not been arrested yet, but his name no longer floated untouched above the mess. It sat in official notes now. It had shape, weight, exposure. Families around the North Shore began to speak up. Some came into the diner with folded letters and old tax records. Some called June from kitchens they had spent years believing were too small to matter. One elderly couple brought in a rusted coffee can full of receipts and boundary notes the husband had nearly thrown out 3 winters ago. People who had once thought their choices ended at selling quietly or staying afraid were discovering a third possibility. Standing together made room where none had seemed to exist. Blue Lantern Diner became more than a roadside restaurant that week. It became a witness stand with coffee. Wade Mercer had practically adopted a stool by the counter, claiming he was only staying until the roads got less stupid, though everyone knew that excuse had worn thin. He looked more comfortable in his own skin now, as if stepping up that day had returned something to him that years of hard driving and harmless silence had taken. His laugh came easier. His shoulders sat differently. He still wore his navy jacket and red flannel, still held his mug like it was built into his hand, but there was less apology in him. Lena Foss came in every morning before 8 with the same paperback, the same tea, the same disciplined spine. Yet even she had changed. The retired school teacher's gaze now held a visible gentleness when it rested on Marin. She had become part witness, part guardian, part moral weather vane for the room. If a story was told inaccurately within 10 feet of Lena, it did not stay inaccurate for long. Elias Bell had changed most quietly. His body was still frail. The heart trouble had not vanished because the truth had surfaced. He still moved with care, and there were moments when he had to grip the counter longer than pride preferred. But the hunted look was leaving him. The old man's eyes no longer kept flicking toward the windows as if expecting memory to walk in wearing boots. He had begun sleeping again, or at least Marin said he had. The deep shame that had bent his shoulders for years seemed to be lifting by grains instead of pounds. Some healing arrived like medicine. Some arrived like thaw. Marin changed in a way Talon felt more than saw at first. She still wore the cream turtleneck and navy apron, still moved quickly between tables, still tucked loose strands of auburn hair behind one ear when she was overwhelmed. But the frightened reflex had left her body. Not entirely, No person shed fear that cleanly, but enough that it no longer ruled her. The diner had once been something she was trying to keep from collapsing. Now it was something she was actively choosing to protect. There was a difference between surviving a place and belonging to it. Maren had crossed that distance. The reopened investigation into her mother's death had not given her peace yet. Only direction. And direction, Talon thought, was sometimes the first honest form of peace. That afternoon, while a weak sun pushed silver light across the lot, an old woman Talon had never seen before entered the diner carrying a battered leather handbag and a look that seemed stitched from nerves and resolve. She was in her 70s, tall in the brittle way some northern women became with age, her white hair rolled into a neat knot at the back of her head. Her coat was camel wool, old but elegant, and her pale face held the fine-boned severity of someone who had once been beautiful in a manner that scared weaker people. She introduced herself as Beatrice Holloway, widow of a former county surveyor. Her voice trembled only once. "I heard what happened to Deke," she said. "And I heard June reopen the shoreline files. My husband kept duplicates. He said one day someone decent might need them." The entire diner went still. Beatrice opened her bag and removed a bundle of folded plats, meeting notes, and one yellow legal pad covered in a dead man's careful handwriting. Then she laid them on the counter in front of Maren. "My husband was afraid," she said. "He should have done more. I should have too." Maren stared down at the papers like a person watching one more hidden room open in the house of her own life. Beatrice touched her hand only once. "Fear is expensive," she murmured, "but silence is worse." Then she turned and left before anyone could ask her to stay. For a long moment, no one in the diner moved, not because of shock, because hope had just walked in wearing an old woman's coat and placed itself on the counter. By evening, June had the Holloway copies in evidence. By night, Duval's office had been served. By the next morning, the town had stopped speaking his name like it belonged only to men in suits. There would still be hearings, delays, objections, men with good watches and expensive language trying to make theft sound procedural. Talon knew that much. Evil rarely died dramatically in America. Usually it got filed against, exposed, appealed, and slowly bled out under fluorescent lighting. But the center had shifted, and sometimes that was enough to begin. It was on the third clear morning after the arrest that Talon finally decided to leave. He had called ahead to postpone his contract once. He could not do it indefinitely. Whatever this town had become to him, it was still not the life he had built. He had spent years training himself to move on, to pack lightly, to never let a place ask for more than he could afford to leave behind. Men like him survived by staying in motion. Motion kept memory from catching up. His truck was already loaded when he came back inside for one last coffee. The diner was bright that morning. The windows had begun to thaw at the edges, and drops of melted snow slipped from the roof outside in a slow, steady rhythm. The bell over the door rang with ordinary cheer instead of alarm. Wade was laughing at something Lena had said about truckers and grammar. Elias was pouring batter with a steadier hand. Maren stood behind the counter counting change, sunlight touching the tired gold in her hair. She looked up when Talon entered. "You're really going?" He gave the smallest nod. "Road's clear enough." The words landed between them heavier than they should have. Maren lowered the till drawer and came around the counter. Up close, her face held that new strength again, but also something gentler, more vulnerable than anything she had shown him in the chaos of the week. "You could have kept driving the first day," she said. "I know." "You didn't." "No." She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know what to call that." Talon glanced toward Orion. The shepherd was standing near the door, head slightly tilted, watching both of them with the calm seriousness he brought to everything that mattered. "Bad timing," Talon said. That made her laugh through the shine gathering in her eyes. Then Elias called from behind the counter, "Coffee's on the house if you sit down like a human being, and not a fugitive." Talon almost smiled. He took the cup, walked back outside, opened the truck door. "Load up," he told Orion. The dog did not move. Talon waited. Orion looked at the truck, then at Talon. Then back through the diner window, where Marasin was turning the open sign, where Wade leaned over his mug, where Lena corrected him about something trivial and important, where Elias moved beneath warm light in the place he had finally stopped fearing. Again, Talon said, "Orion." The shepherd stepped forward once, then stopped. There was nothing theatrical in it. No dramatic whine, no paw on a suitcase. Just refusal so calm it could not be mistaken. Orion sat down in the snow by the diner door and lifted his head, as if the answer had been obvious to him for some time, and he was only waiting for Talon to catch up. Wade, watching through the glass, barked a laugh. Lena smiled into her tea without looking up. Marin stood very still. Talon looked at the dog for a long moment, then at the truck, then at his own reflection in the window. Broad-shouldered, weathered, built for departure, and somehow more tired of leaving than he had allowed himself to admit. That was the thing about fate, he thought. It rarely arrived like thunder. More often it came as recognition, a quiet refusal in the body, a place that did not feel like a trap and therefore frightened a man more honestly than danger ever could. He closed the truck door. When he came back inside, nobody celebrated. That was another mercy. Elias only slid a fresh cup toward booth 7. Wade muttered, "Dog's smarter than most men." "Low bar," Lena replied. Marin did not speak at first. She only watched Talon sit by the window again, not like a stranded traveler now, but like a man trying on the dangerous possibility of remaining. At last she walked over and set a plate in front of him. Eggs, toast, potatoes, exactly what he had ordered on the first day, back when he thought this stop would last 40 minutes and nothing more. "On the house?" Talon asked. Marin folded her arms. "Don't get used to yourself." The dry humor in her voice was soft, but it stayed. Outside, the northern world remained wide and white and mythic in its winter silence. The lake still held its frozen breath. The pines still stood like dark witnesses along the road. Nothing about the landscape had become easier. Inside Blue Lantern Diner, however, something sacred and ordinary had changed forever. The coffee was strong. The pie case glowed. Spoons touched ceramic. The bell over the door rang each time another neighbor entered, carrying stories, papers, questions, courage. The diner had become a place where people did not come only to eat. They came to remember that their loneliness had been exaggerated by fear. Orion crossed the floor and lay down by Talon's boots with a long, satisfied exhale. Talon looked at the dog, then at Marin behind the counter, at Elias in the kitchen, at Wade and Lena arguing gently about weather and road salt, at the window full of pale sun and thawing snow. There were places a man passed through, and there were places that, without asking permission, began slowly to gather the scattered pieces of him. When the bell rang again and another customer stepped in out of the cold, Talon did not reach for his keys. He reached for his coffee. And in the warm, bright heart of that little roadside diner, with winter still stretching vast and white beyond the glass, no one lowered their eyes anymore. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder, fire, or a voice from the sky. Sometimes they come as a quiet moment when one person decides not to look away. Sometimes they come through an old diner in a snowstorm, through a tired father finding the courage to tell the truth, through a young woman learning that fear does not have the final word, and even through a faithful dog who seems to sense the road God is opening before anyone else can see it. This story reminds us that evil often grows in silence, but so does courage. And when one heart stands up, other hearts begin to remember who they are. That is how God often works in ordinary life. Not always through spectacle, but through small acts of protection, truth, mercy, and timing so perfect it feels heaven-touched. A stranger arrives at the right moment. A hidden truth comes to light. A broken place becomes a shelter again. What some people call coincidence, others may recognize as grace. The lesson is simple but powerful. Never underestimate the holy weight of showing up for someone in their darkest hour. You may think your voice is small, your help is limited, or your presence does not matter, but God can use even the smallest act of courage to begin changing an entire life. In daily life, this may mean speaking up when someone is being mistreated, checking on a neighbor who seems alone, protecting the weak, telling the truth when silence feels easier, or choosing kindness when the world has become cold. These are not small things. These are the places where light enters. And maybe that is the real miracle of this story. Not only that justice began to rise, but that hearts changed. Fear lost ground. Community woke up. A wounded man found a reason to stay. A grieving daughter found strength. A town remembered that it did not have to bow forever. When God moves, He does not only change outcomes, He changes people. If this story touched your heart, please share in the comments a moment when God, kindness, or unexpected courage showed up in your life. Share this video with someone who may need hope today, and subscribe to the channel if you believe stories of compassion, faith, and second chances still matter in this world. May God bless every person watching. May He protect your home, strengthen your heart, guide your steps when the road is uncertain, and bring light into every place in your life that feels cold, silent, or lost. Amen.